Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel BethChatsBooks. Now today's video is going to be my top 10 most disappointing reads of 2022. Now I'm gonna just put this as the most disappointing reads of the year instead of the worst books, because a lot of these books, they're not terrible, you know, books that are so bad they shouldn't be published. A lot of these I gave 3 stars. They were solidly written books. They just weren't my kind of books, and I think for the right reader, quite a few of these will really hit with some people, but they just didn't hit with me. So I'm going to try and keep this video a little bit more concise than the other one. So let's just dive straight in. So the first 2 that I want to talk about, by the way, these are in no particular order, like the same with my best books of 2022, they were in no rank order. These 2 books I'm going to talk about together because they have the same author, and that is Distress Signals and The Liar's Girl by Catherine Ryan Howard. Now, I have loved Catherine Ryan Howard's books in the last few years. 56 Days and The Nothing Man I both gave 5 stars to, and I really want to read Rewind and her new one, Runtime. So I wanted to go back and read her backlist. Now, Distress Signals was her very first novel and The Liar's Girl came out a year later, and I do think there is a massive discrepancy in her writing talent between the first 2 novels and the more recent ones. I think she has really progressed as a writer, and I think those 2 books just feel very different in structure and tone than the more recent ones. So I think if you really liked her more recent work, I would probably not go back and read these 2. So the first one, Distress Signals, was set on a cruise ship, and there was somebody murdering people on the cruise ship, and it sounded like a really interesting premise to me. However, it was really dragged out. I can't even remember that many details. I just remember that a girl, essentially, I think she went missing on a cruise ship, and her boyfriend, I think her boyfriend ended up trying to figure out what happened to her, and so he went on this cruise ship. I still can't even really remember, and then I think a member of the crew ends up being involved. It's so grainy, I cannot remember at all, but there was a lot of kind of monologues of the characters, particularly the killer's perspective. There was just chapters of just the thought process of the individual. There was kind of no action, and the plot just didn't feel like it kept the reader engaged. So I remember really dragging my heels through this book, and like I've just proven, I can't really remember much about what happened. And then The Liar's Girl I've read a little bit more recently, and it follows an individual who, she went to a university in Dublin, and then her best friend got murdered there, and her boyfriend was accused and sentenced to a long time in prison for her murder and a couple of other murders, and he kind of became a notorious canal killer. And so she moves away to the Netherlands, and she's been living there for 10 years. And then the man Will, who was her boyfriend, who was the convicted killer, has requested to speak to her, and he tells her that he wasn't guilty, and there are now kind of copycat disappearances and murders happening around the university again, and young women are being found dead or are going missing, and he's saying he was never the killer at all. Again, this one was a little bit stronger premise-wise than Distress Signals, so the idea, the synopsis sounded perfect and really interesting to me, but we trudged along for such a long time before we got any kind of action, and this book starts to suggest some of the areas that Catherine Ryan Howard gets really good at. In particular, The Nothing Man really lets us hear from the perspective of a killer, and that darkness of the thoughts process, but in an engaging way. I think these 2 books are kind of her teething novels, and they were both really well written, but I think the plot and the structure and trying to captivate an audience and tease out the mystery in an engaging way was not fully realised in these two novels. So yeah, overall they weren't bad books. I saw that people that reviewed them in the years that they came out regarded them quite highly, but I think from around 2016, when these novels were published, in 2017, we've come so far in the thriller genre that these two books just didn't stack up to more recent, stronger thrillers with premises that were delivered in a propulsive way. So unfortunately they're on this list. And then the next one I have is Wheelie Here by Rachel Howes Hall. And this one was one that I read on Kindle Unlimited, and it had a really interesting, striking cover. But I think it was a kind of instance of no substance, all kind of image, because I again am really struggling to remember what happened in this book. And I know that a lot of people in the booktube community have a very love-hate relationship with this author, and I would like to read some more books of hers that are available on Kindle Unlimited and try and figure out if it was just the book or whether it's the author that's not really gelling with me. But essentially this is about a woman who returns home to California for her parents' wedding anniversary party, and there's a heavy reference of her having asthma in the book. And we find out that an estranged cousin in her family is trying to send her messages and warnings. And when she gets back to the family home, things aren't quite right between her and her mother in particular. And she kind of feels like people are setting her up. She keeps having incidents where it looks like she's been involved, but someone's kind of staged things, and she finds that she seems like she's losing the plot a little bit, and everybody is kind of saying that she's acting erratically. And then obviously we get the conclusion of this, but this was a story that didn't really go anywhere for me. The reveals were not particularly shocking, but also I got to the point where I didn't care because the character development wasn't invested in by the author, so I felt like the protagonist was irritating. I know that she had a chronic illness, and I know with her asthma, and that was kind of mentioned a lot in the book, but it didn't really add to the overall plot, so therefore it kind of became secondary, and it kind of, the author leaned heavily on that as a character development point, which it didn't really develop her character at all. Her boyfriend, who was kind of meant to be supportive, I kind of got vibes all the way along that he was sketchy, and it turns out he wasn't quite sketchy. And I kind of didn't see the point of posing him as somebody who was potentially quite sketchy, if that wasn't going to be developed. And all of her family, like not many of them had redeeming qualities. They didn't particularly seem to care whether she was there or not. So a lot of the whole her coming back to find out the truth about her family just felt really flat, because nobody seemed to care in the whole novel, and the protagonist I didn't invest in, so I really didn't actually care at some of the more nail-biting scenes at the end, because I didn't really care about whether she lived or died or what situation she was getting herself into, so it's on this list for that reason. And then the next book is Babysitter by Joyce Carol Oates. I basically skim-read through this book, so I have no real understanding of whether I enjoyed it or not. I was just very early on not gelling with it. I took it out of the library as an ebook, and I kind of hovered over it. And I think this was a case of it being a fantastic synopsis, but then the development of it just wasn't very interesting for me. Now I do want to go back and read a lot more Joyce Carol Oates, because she is really well regarded in the book community. But I think this one just sounded like it was going to be very true crime like, and it was a lot more literary and philosophical and flowery language and just floating on ideas, and the plot wasn't moving anywhere. So from what I can remember, this follows a lady who's about to embark on an affair, and she's kind of a housewife, and this man may or may not be a killer. There's kind of a killer going around taking children at the moment, and she seems to be very airy-fairy and in a complete world of her own, and she keeps going back to this situation where she starts this affair and this man doesn't really seem to care much about her, and it seems borderline like she's kind of embarking on this relationship as a kind of form of self-punishment, because there seems to be no intimacy between her and this person, and he's a mysterious figure, and she's enamoured with this experience more than she is with the reality of it, and it kind of feels very like dreamlike. You're not really sure what's real and what's not in this story. It was just very floaty, and I found that just really grated on me after a while, and I just didn't understand where we were going with this. Maybe it was just too hefty and intelligent for me, and maybe it just went completely over my head, but I did find that I was just not really connecting with the plot. And then the next one was The Lincoln Highway by Amor Towles. I had to read this for the BookTube prize earlier this year, and this kind of essentially is a road trip book between two brothers who they have to go on this kind of embarking long sweeping journey to get things back on track. So the brother is released from, he's kind of been incarcerated, and then he comes home and his father's died, and he has to take on the manly role and look after his brother, who's, we kind of assume, has some kind of learning disability. And there's a lady who kind of lived next door who's kind of always had a thing for the brother, and she kind of has always supported the little younger brother while he's been incarcerated, and so she kind of gets involved sometimes, and then they kind of end up trying to travel the Lincoln Highway, which was like a stretch of road that linked part of America together. And while they never really managed to get on it, friends that have escaped from the incarcerated unit that the boy was in, they end up embarking on adventures with him and stealing his car, and then he's got to go and find it, and then they go here, there and everywhere, and essentially like male road trip all American storylines are just really tedious for me. I know I've had a lot of controversy in a previous video that I put up about On the Road by Jack Kerouac, and essentially that book, a lot of people love it, and this book, a lot of people love it. It has that all American nostalgia to it. For me, these male characters didn't interest me, and personal preference, I like a story that has a plot that takes me somewhere. I found that I'm just not really that interested in kind of people finding themselves journeys, particularly male-centric ones, and particularly kind of prison narratives and kind of coming out and re-establishing themselves into the community. It's just personal preference. They don't interest me. And the idea of being in a car and travelling wherever, it's just not my bag of tricks. Like nature writing isn't my kind of thing. Certain genres, it's just a genre I don't like. So I know in the past I've got myself into trouble talking about these kind of stories, and it's not dissing this book, and it's not dissing Jack Kerouac's book. It's just they're not particularly interesting, and I don't think On the Road aged well. And I put that video up maybe 4 years ago, and people still trash me on it, but it was just my opinion. There we go. And then the next one is The Five Wounds by Kirstin Valdez, and this is a story, I think it's set in Mexico, or it's definitely South America, and it kind of follows a family where Angel is the youngest, and she's found out she's pregnant. She's about 16, and her father is quite young, I think he's in his 30s, and she flees her mum's house. They've had a big argument. She takes the stuff and turns up at her grandma's house where her dad is also living. And it's about them coming to terms with this kind of 3 generations in one roof situation. The grandma has a terminal illness, and she doesn't really tell any of the family, because it seems like she has to kind of pick everybody up all the time. And the father kind of has issues with drink, and he wasn't particularly a very attentive father to Angel, and he doesn't seem particularly interested and enamoured with fixing that relationship at the moment. And then Angel has the baby, and it's kind of the repercussions of having a new member of the family at the same time as the kind of inevitability of losing the grandma. and them all trying to kind of meld together and figure everything out. Angel kind of questions her sexuality, motherhood, the father deals with alcoholism, the grandma deals with terminal illness. So there's a lot of heavy themes, but I just think, although I feel like this one I kind of begrudgingly put on this list because I didn't fully hate this one. I just think it didn't go anywhere in an interesting way for me. Like, Crossroads was one of my favourite of this year, and it had similar kind of themes and a similar setup, but I just wasn't connected to the characters. Angel and the father were characters I just didn't connect with. So I found that I was reading the book, but just with a detachment, which just meant it was fine, but it just wasn't the reading experience I wanted it to be. So that's why it's on this list. And then next one is Hairpin Bridge by Taylor Adams. This was probably like the more badly written book out of the ones on this list. I think the kind of premise of the plot was pointless. Essentially, this character is being chased from a guy that we kind of find out that she kind of knows, and so we're hearing from her perspective, trying to run away from this man, and then her twin is trying to find out what happened to her, and she's kind of crossing over similar experiences to her sister. She's connecting with the same characters, but I just remember reading this book and thinking it was just a little bit stupid the way it was structured. And I know Taylor Adams is renowned for her other book, No Exit, which everybody thinks is just phenomenal. And I saw a lot of reviews for this one, and a lot of people thought it was a bit meh as well. I just think we had a lot of action build up for ages, and we were delayed that, and then at the end it just pushed so much like bizarre blockbuster style action for no reason. There was like a snake involved in the end, and there was just like guns, and it was all really like ridiculous, like ricocheting everything off, you know, people flipping off like cars, like that level of like Hollywood movie, but just seems really disproportionate to the whole rest of the story. And those action scenes were just getting really tedious for me. I was like, I don't really care. It's like you kind of wrote this for a male audience, and all your female readers are getting to this point in the book and thinking, what the hell, like, why are we reading like 4 pages of, and then he nearly shot her, and then she got in the car, and then she drove around the corner, and then she nearly shot him, and then she ducked under this, and like, no, it's not my bag of tricks, and I just didn't really get it. So yeah. And then the next one is Hell of a Book by Jason Mott. Loads of people have raved about this. I think this was another BookTube prize book. I just didn't like it, and I'm finding it hard to remember a lot of the plot line. I know that he kind of saw this imaginary boy. He's this man's going on book tour, and he's got this book, and it's like everybody comes up to him and he goes, oh, that's a hell of a book, and that's kind of the title of why it's called Hell of a Book. And he's going on tour, and then there's like this young black boy who he kind of just keeps popping up at random moments, and there's, you know, kind of like there's comedic moments where they're trying to have him, like the first scene of the book, he's like running away because this husband has found out that he's sleeping with his wife, and he's kind of running across the hotel like completely naked, and he's trying to get into his hotel room, and he's picking up a magazine in the reception saying, oh, it's me, look, there's a picture of me, let me into my you know, give me my keys to let me into my hotel room, which some people have found like really funny, but yeah, I just remember it was a lot of like tedious bits about book tour, and lots of inner dialogue from a voice that I just found very irritating. And then it was trying to push this commentary on this little boy was a reflection of kind of a lot of political and racial issues in America, which are topics that I'm really interested in. I just think the way that this was packaged just didn't connect with me, because I found like the kind of trying to make the connections just felt a little bit still didn't organically feel there for me. But that's pretty much all I can remember about the plot, so it really wasn't memorable for me. And then the next book is While Justice Sleeps by Stacey Abrams. And this was a political thriller, and this is the first kind of political thriller that I have read. I would like to explore the genre more, but the caveat for kind of why I put this here is that I think if you don't have a lot of understanding of the American justice system and the political structures in America, then I would probably do a bit of research before you go into this, or just skip it if that's something that doesn't interest you, because I went into this book hoping that it would teach me a lot, but ultimately it kind of expected me to know how the American legal system and structures work. This is set in the US Supreme Court, and Avery Keene is a law clerk for Justice Howard Wynne, and then we find out that he has a swing vote in a really important political decision, and that just before that decision is going to be made, somebody has attacked him and he is in a coma, and so she has to figure out what's going on, and she ends up getting involved with Justice Wynne's son to try and figure out what happened. It was very politically heavy, and a lot of stuff I just didn't understand, and I think that detracted from it for me. I think the writing was amazing, and I think I would like to read more from this author, but I think it was a personal thing that for me, because I just didn't understand some of the ways that things were operating, the decisions that Avery was making, the importance of this vote just didn't really connect to me as strongly as it probably would have done for an American living in America reading this book. So I wouldn't say that this is a book that I wouldn't recommend to people, because I definitely would, and I think a lot of people would get a lot out of it, and I've seen a lot of Americans rate this book very highly, but for me, I just think some of the puzzle pieces were left not fully filled, and so I remember kind of reading the book and finishing it, I'm just feeling a little bit confused, like I didn't have that satisfying ending because things didn't wrap up fully into like a nice bow for me. But it does have a bit of a side romance that develops that is quite fun to read about. So if you kind of like just a little bit of a slice of romance in the middle of your thriller without it detracting from the thriller, then I think you'll really like this. And I think Stacey Abrams does write romance novels. So I think if you've read this book and you kind of liked that development and you would like to see how she writes romance specifically, then I would go and check those books out. But I'm not really a romance reader. I probably won't be checking her books out anytime soon, but that's not to say that you can't. And then the final book on this list is Fuzz by Mary Roach. This definitely was one of my BookTube Prize selections that I had to read this year. This is a non-fiction book, and it's kind of the title is something along the lines of When Animals Break the Law, and I thought the premise sounded really interesting, but nature writing, I kind of class that as animal writing, is not really my bag of tricks, so I was a little bit apprehensive reading this. And overall, I didn't love it. I know so many people loved it, and I didn't. She kind of breaks the chapters into animals and looks at how different societies, human societies and populations that have encroached on animal populations and environments, how they've kind of clashed, and how human beings and societies have tried to combat or deal with it. I think it has some really interesting facts in here. Some chapters I found really interesting, particularly bears in America and this whole trespassing into human homes, and kind of the idea that bins have to be locked down so that bears can't get into them. and I found the elephants in India really interesting. But then we kind of got some repetitive chapters where it was kind of a similar format, and then we kind of got onto animals that were less and less and less interesting. Now, for somebody who is really into birds, they might think it's really insulting what I'm going to say, but birds tend to be more boring animals to read about in a written text than bears or, you know, elephants or tigers or things like that. And then we started getting to, you know, at one point there was a chapter on rats, which is not particularly interesting to me. So I think for somebody who's really interested in animals and how humans are encroaching on their environment, and are interested in environmental, ecological, those kind of subject areas, you'll really enjoy this. And Mary Roach can really write narrative non-fiction. This felt really fun and playful. I just think the subject matter wasn't mine. This book wasn't for me, but for the right reader, I think it will be just what they want to read. I do want to read another Mary Roach book called Stiff, which I think talks about human cadavers and that kind of process, and that topic area is something that interests me a lot more than this one, macabre as that sounds. So I think I would definitely read her because I think she can really write, and when she's passionate about subject, it's very apparent in the way that she structures and writes about it. But for me, it was just a case of the subject matter didn't engage me, and therefore it was a bit of a trudge read. But that is all 10 of my most disappointing reads for me personally. I just want to make that very apparent that these are all very good books for the right people. I think, and I hope that maybe some of you will have watched this video and found that some of those sound really interesting to you and you want to go and check them out. So this is not a Slate author's environment here, but I just want to say thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with a brand new video. Bye now.